Hello everyone, it's SpawnPoiint and this is the brand new 42-inch OLED monitor from ASUS. It's called the ROG PG42UQ and I've been using it over the last month as my main monitor. Well, today I'm going to give you my updated thoughts on it, including what I like, dislike and whether this could be the ultimate monitor. I'll go over what it's like for gaming on as well as how it performs as a productivity monitor. I'll even compare it to its biggest competitor, the LG C2, and which one I would choose. So this screen is actually using the same panel seen in the 42-inch LG C2, and we know the C2 is already a great TV. Well, what ASUS have done is they've taken that, they've stripped it down, and then they've added their own features on top. It's got all of the usual specs and features you would expect, including HDMI 2.1, VRR, HDR, 4K, and up to 138Hz. But it's also got a DisplayPort, a custom heatsink, and an anti-glare coating. And the fact that it's an OLED means there are no dimming zones, as the pixels are all self-lit, creating an almost perfect contrast and black levels. So spec-wise, this ticks most of the boxes for both work and play. And from a gaming point of view, this thing is an absolute beast. Over the last few weeks I've played games like Warzone, Saints Row, and I've even completed the new Last of Us remake. So plenty of time to test it out and see how it performs. It supports everything that you need, including 4K, VRR, and 120Hz, so it's perfect for the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. It also has G-Sync compatibility as well as one DisplayPort and 4 HDMI ports, where 2 of these are HDMI 2.1. But unfortunately there's no support for eARC, which means you cannot actually send your audio back to your AVR or your soundbar. Checking the stats on both the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X, you can see it ticks everything on here, apart from Dolby Vision. So you really are getting everything needed for both of these consoles. VRR, or the variable refresh rate, means the games run smoothly and there's no screen tearing or stuttering while playing. Not all games support this natively, but the games that do look great. And there's something awesome about playing story-driven games on a screen this big. It is incredibly immersive. Pair that with some decent headphones and you're practically in the game. Now for FPS or fast-paced games like Warzone or Apex, you might struggle if you're using a screen this big sitting this close. You'll either want to sit further back or reduce the overall screen size. I've used it fine for the last month, but I can honestly say this is too big for my normal Warzone sessions. Any other game is fine, but I think 32 inch is still my preferred size. But some say size matters, bigger is better and all that, but is 42 inches too big for a monitor? Well, I think that depends on how you're using it. And if you didn't want to use the full 42 inches, you could either resize or reposition your windows, or you could use the inbuilt aspect ratio controller instead. So at a click of a button, you can toggle between 24, 27 and 34 inches. And on top of that, you can even move the positioning of this boxed area. And this will work on any connected device too, as it keeps the ratio the same, it just changes the overall screen size. And if you wondered what resolution you get while playing in this mode, well, it's obviously not going to be 4K as the pixels aren't there, but the connected devices still recognize it as a 4K panel. Now this is obviously marketed as a gaming focused monitor with the various gaming features and design, but it is still a monitor. Now what puts this monitor above say the LG TV equivalents like the C2 OLED is the fact that it comes with a DisplayPort. I've hooked up my MacBook Pro to test it out, and to make the most of those 120Hz capability, I'm using one of these USB-C to DisplayPort cables. Using the HDMI port on my Mac would actually limit me to just 60Hz. So over the last few weeks, to really test this out, I've been running all of the usual tasks that I'd normally do on my ultrawide. And that's to see if this is viable to use day to day. That includes reading and writing documents, checking emails and editing videos. Firstly, the size of this display is huge. You can fit so much on here both vertically and horizontally that you really don't need any more space than this. You can snap multiple windows, whether that's a document on one side and a website on another, or you could easily push it to 3. And if you wonder what app I'm using to snap these windows across the screen, this is called Magnet, and it's about £7 on the App Store. Well, last week I edited my entire YouTube video using this monitor and everything looked awesome. Being able to see my entire timeline in one view was a huge advantage. But not only that, the text clarity is incredibly good. It's hard to capture on here, but I was really impressed with how sharp the text looked, even with that anti-glare coating. On top of that, as I'm using the 120Hz mode, everything looks smooth and completely stutter-free. Whether that's scrolling through a timeline or documents or just moving windows around the screen, it is silky smooth. Also, the response I get from moving my mouse around the screen is instant, there's no noticeable delay. Now, as this is a monitor rather than a TV, it does mean it's got one of the most useful features, and that's wake from sleep. So this means if you put the monitor into standby mode, it will wake as soon as you turn your PC or your laptop on. It also has an auto switcher, so if you turn one device off and then another one on, it'll automatically switch over to the new port, again like a normal monitor would perform. So we've covered gaming and productivity, but what if you wanted to do both at the same time? Well, fortunately it does have an inbuilt picture-by-picture or picture-in-picture mode. This will let you run two inputs at exactly the same time. So I tested it with the PlayStation 5 and my MacBook and it worked really well, either by using picture-in-picture and moving the image around the screen, or the picture-by-picture mode where the images are side by side. I couldn't get HDR to work on the PlayStation 5 while using this mode, so I did have to disable that, but otherwise it looked good. The PS5 still recognised this mode as a 4K 120Hz display, so you could have a game running at the same time as viewing or reading a walkthrough guide. Or if you wanted a Windows PC and a MacBook, that would work as well. So we already know it's got the LG C2 OLED panel underneath, so you would assume it's identical in terms of picture quality and performance. Well, during my testing so far, I would say it's 90% the same, but there are a few obvious differences. Now, the colour and vibrancy of the picture is incredible. It's obvious that it's got an OLED panel. It's got the usual 98% colour space, 10-bit colour and HDR10. Out of the box, the colours look accurate and are as punchy as you'd expect from an OLED, so movies and games really do look great on here. It's also calibrated out of the box, so there aren't really any settings to tweak as such, other than just the brightness and the contrast. But one of the biggest selling points of an OLED is the infinite blacks and that awesome contrast ratio. But with the anti-glare coating on this screen, you will notice the blacks are more of a hazy dark grey instead of jet black. Comparing this to a normal IPS panel, this is still very impressive. But it's only when you compare it to a normal glossy OLED you do notice the difference. It was actually only when I went back to my LG C1, the 77-inch I've got here, that is when I noticed just how flat the image looked in comparison on the ROG. Now, another point that I did touch on very briefly in my first impressions video is that the screen doesn't suffer from ABL, or the auto brightness limiter, and that's where the screen dims very slightly when showing bright images like Word documents, then it pops back to full brightness if you move your mouse or change the window. I was actually really excited to test this out and see it in action, but unfortunately during my testing I just could not get this to work. I enabled the uniform brightness mode in the settings and then I left the screen alone for a couple of minutes, but as soon as I moved or scrolled the screen it popped back to full brightness exactly the same as the C2 and the G2. Genuinely, I'm actually really disappointed with the result of this. Now obviously it's not quite as aggressive as the C2 and the G2, but it definitely still exists and it's something that might annoy you as using it as a monitor. I've also noticed that there's a very slight blue tint on the outer edges and a warmer colour in the middle. This is only noticeable on pure white screens, and as you move off centre the colour does shift. Now this is actually a known characteristic of OLEDs unfortunately, so it's not limited to just this display, but I still wanted to mention it anyway. And one of the comments I often get when using an OLED is concerns of burn-in, but the ROG OLED has been designed to combat that with their own large custom heatsink. ASUS have taken their experience with cooling motherboards and graphics cards and applied that to the monitor. Obviously I've only been using this for a month, so it's impossible to see if the heatsink is doing its job, but the fact that the heatsink even exists is a positive sign. It's also fanless as well, so there's no noise at all. So poking out just under the monitor are two 10-watt Harman Kardon speakers, and above those is a 15-watt woofer. Most of the time while gaming I will use headphones, as it's pretty rare that I will use the speakers. But for productivity, when you have a video playing or some music in the background, these are a lot more useful than I expected. It means you don't need or have to have external speakers or headphones on during the day. Sure, they're not going to sound as good or be as immersive as headphones or a dedicated soundbar, but they are pretty good. I would put them on par with every other OLED TV that I've used this year, with a slight bump in bass and clarity. But here's a quick test to give you an idea of what they sound like. I mentioned this in my unboxing, but the overall look and design of this monitor without a doubt has a gaming vibe to it. The rear design, the metal feet, even the red ROG logo on the front. There's no denying this is aimed more towards gaming than a normal desktop monitor, but it still looks nice with the ultra thin bezels and frame, and it looks sleek enough to not be an eyesore on your desk. Also, the tiltable stand is a great addition to have. Let's take a quick look at the menu on this monitor. So if you tap the 5-way joystick underneath, it will bring up this on-screen display. It doesn't look anything special, but it is functional. So you've got a few gaming focused features like turning overclocking on to get that 138Hz and enabling G-Sync. Then in the Game Plus area, you can turn on an FPS counter, a crosshair, or even add a sniper box. And this creates a magnified area in the center of your screen. There's a visual mode where you can toggle between picture presets. And then under the image, you can actually change the brightness and enable the uniform brightness setting. And this is also where the aspect ratio controller is. The color space and color temp can be adjusted along with the gamma option. The different input selections, the picture-in-picture mode, which we've covered already. Favorites lets you actually change the default button layout for the joystick. And finally, we've got the system setup. So there's things like the language settings, sound options, and whether you want the ROG logo to be on. There's also different power settings and the OSD setup. But as this is an OLED, there's also the usual screen protection settings like pixel cleaning and other options in the settings. It is pretty limited in terms of what you can do here. I mean, there's no picture setting controls or adjustments like you would see on other OLED TVs, as this is essentially already calibrated. Now, I know a lot of you wanted me to cover this, and that's comparing this monitor to the LG C2. And I would say on a like-for-like comparison, the LG C2 OLED is the only real competitor to this. They are similar in size and offer very similar features, but there are a few areas that set them apart that could sway you one way or another. So the ASUS monitor comes with an anti-glare screen, which depending on your setup could be an advantage. It has a DisplayPort for connecting it to your PC, and a custom heatsink to help with keeping it brighter. It also has that awesome aspect ratio controller to change the screen size. And then there's the fact that it acts like a monitor too, so it will auto switch on or off and go into standby. And then there's the LG C2, so it has a glossy screen which naturally means better contrast and black levels. It has 4 HDMI 2.1 ports instead of just 2. It also has all of the usual TV features and apps. So if you wanted a TV and a monitor, well, you could have both with this screen. But finally, the price. So the PG42UQ is currently £1,400, while the 42-inch C2 is actually currently £1,000 up to about £1,200. So that's a difference of £200 to £400, which ultimately comes down to if you see value in the different features. Personally, which might surprise you, I would just go for the LG C2. The money saving alone is a big one. Then there's the added TV features, more HDMI 2.1 ports, and if you prefer a glossy OLED screen, well, that's an easy choice anyway. And then it also has the game optimizer mode, which is an awesome feature. But if you want an anti-glare screen to prevent reflections, a DisplayPort, a brighter panel with a heatsink, and an impressive aspect ratio controller, the ASUS Swift OLED is hard to beat. Now, my dream spec right now, if you were interested, would be a 32-inch OLED with a glossy screen, speakers, heatsink, and an integrated RGB lighting. A bit like the Philips Hue monitors where it reacts to what's on the screen. But what about you? Does the ASUS PG42UQ tick every box from a monitor, or are you leaning more towards something else instead? And if you drop an OLED monitor in the comments, I will give you a thumbs up for staying right till the end. And if you did enjoy today's video, check out my Nova Pro video next, as that covers my thoughts on the latest SteelSeries gaming headset. Thanks for watching, please like, sub, and follow me on Instagram and Twitter. Until next time.